Let's unpack this. We are diving into a pretty high stakes scenario that really erupted almost immediately following a major conviction. We're focusing today on the confinement of Sean Diddy Combs. He's what, just weeks into his 50-month sentence? And already his projected release date has been significantly delayed.
Yeah, it's more than just a headline, isn't it? It's this immediate, very public demonstration of the relentless pressure cooker that is institutional confinement, especially, when you're talking about a high-profile inmate. We're getting a rare, really early look at how quickly internal disciplinary stuff can actually alter someone's legal status. Doesn't matter how much fame or wealth they have outside.
Exactly. So our mission today is basically to synthesize the reported reasons behind that delay. We're going to track the shift in his freedom date, look closely at two very distinct and pretty aggressive allegations of prison rule violations. This is happening at FCI Fort Dix. And crucially, we have to balance those reports with the equally unified and aggressive defense that his legal team is mounting.
Right. And our sources are pretty comprehensive here. We've got reports derived directly from Federal Bureau of Prisons, the FBP inmate records. We also have specific, very detailed statements from spokespersons, attorneys like Judah Engelmayer, Mark Agnifilo, and of course, various news accounts, TMZ, CBS News, People, all published within a really narrow, intense time frame back in November. So this deep dive, it connects the dots, right, from the initial sentencing through these alleged infractions, one about contraband, the other about procedure, and then to the resulting rescission to his release timeline. We're definitely committed to an unbiased look at all the reported facts and, the counter-narratives.
Okay, so let's jump right into section one then. The core change and the resulting extended sentence timeline. We really need to establish the specific shift first. When Combs was initially processed, right after his October sentencing, what was the date the FBP actually set for his release? And what's this new revised date we're looking at now?
Okay, so when he was first admitted, processed, the Federal Bureau of Prisons documented his projected release date as May 8th, 2028. That's based on the standard sentencing guidelines and how they calculate projected good time credits. But when those same FBP inmate records were accessed later, specifically on Wednesday, November 12th, well, a new date had popped up.
And that revision pushes his freedom out by how much exactly?
The new revised projected release date is now June 4th, 2028.
June 4th, okay.
Yeah, that's a substantial change. It represents a delay of 27 days added to his confinement time. I mean, if you think about a 4-year sentence, adding nearly a full month this early on, that's a significant punitive action.
What's immediately fascinating here, though, is the technical detail, or maybe the lack of it, in the public record. So the FBP confirms the date change, right? But the source material explicitly says the official reason for the delay is, quote, not clear. Why do we believe then, or why is the assumption, that this change is tied to these alleged disciplinary issues?
Well, you have to look at the technical mechanics of the FBP system. They don't typically just recalculate a release date unless there's a specific internal administrative trigger. So while the reason isn't explicitly stated as disciplinary action, the timing is key. The date revision happens immediately after these public reports surface about alleged rule violations. And these are the kinds of violations that would almost certainly result in the loss of what are called good time credits.
Okay, let's explain what those are, because this seems to be the fundamental mechanism driving the release date, right? What are good time credits? How do you earn them? And maybe more importantly here, how do you lose them?
Right. Good time credits, or GTC, they're defined under federal law. Specifically, it's 18 U.S.C. Section 3624. The law basically allows inmates serving sentences over a year to earn up to 54 days of credit for each year they serve if they comply with institutional rules and participate in designated programs. These credits are often sort of projected at the start of the sentence. So the idea is, if the inmate follows all the rules, they could walk out up to 54 days earlier per year served.
So, if the FDP recalculates the date and pushes it back 27 days, that strongly suggests they've revoked a pretty substantial chunk of the GTC that Combs was either already accruing or at least was projected to accrue during this initial period.
Exactly. That's the most logical conclusion. The process usually involves a disciplinary report, then an investigation, and typically a hearing before what's called a disciplinary hearing officer, or DHO. The DHO determines guilt and then administers sanctions. And those sanctions very often include revoking accumulated or projected GTC for 27 days to be added to the sentence this quickly. I mean, the DHO process must have been initiated, concluded, and the sanction administered all between when the offenses were reported November 7th and 10th and when the record was viewed on November 12th.
Wow.
Yeah, it shows just how rapid and internal the punitive capability of the institution can be.
That speed is, it's pretty astonishing, especially when you think about how long the initial legal process took. But let's quickly lay the groundwork for the listener on the initial legal context and the facilities involved, because that journey where he was held, it matters too.
Absolutely. So Combs, he's 56 years old. He was sentenced back in October to a 50-month term. This was after his conviction in July for 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. His actual time in confinement started earlier, though, back in September 2024 with his arrest.
And he wasn't immediately sent to Fort Dix, which seems like a key detail here.
No, that's right. He was initially held at Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center, the MDC.
Mm.
The MDC is known for being a notoriously tough administrative holding facility. It's often used for inmates waiting for trial or maybe those needing a higher security level temporarily. The transfer from the MDC to where he is now, the Federal Correctional Institution, FCI Fort Dix in New Jersey, that's a crucial environmental shift.
How does FCI Fort Dix specifically contrast with the MDC, and why does the type of facility matter when we start talking about rule violations like these?
Well, FCI Fort Dix is a low-security institution.
Mhm.
In the FBP system, low-security places, while still obviously very restrictive, they function differently than, say, maximum security facilities or holding centers like the MDC. In low security, there's often a bit more access to yard time, programs, general interaction, things like that. But because they rely pretty heavily on the inmate population itself maintaining a certain level of order, the security staff can be extremely sensitive to breaches that challenge that order, things like drug use or, unsanctioned communications. A rule violation there might actually be seen as a more significant threat to the overall stability of the unit than it might be in a higher security place where control is much more centralized and absolute.
Okay, so we have a man serving a pretty long sentence. He's in a facility designed for lower risk inmates, and he sees his freedom date pushed back by 27 days within just weeks of arriving. This leads us directly then to the alleged behaviors that preceded this change. And here's where it gets really interesting, right? Section 2. Allegation 1, the homemade beverage controversy.
Yeah, this is a classic example of institutional misconduct. And the report surfaced almost immediately after he got to Fort Dix. We're talking Friday, November 7th. It involves contraband that is, pretty much endemic to prison life everywhere.
And the specific contraband alleged is that sort of quintessential jailhouse alcohol, known as hooch or puno. But what's kind of incredible here is that the sources provide not just the accusation, but the specific detailed recipe he supposedly used.
They absolutely do. The report was that he was allegedly caught either with it or drinking homemade alcohol. And the sources were very precise. The mixtures supposedly consisted of Fanta soda, sugar, and apples. The process described was fermentation over a 2-week period. This detail, it's crucial because it really illustrates the level of resourcefulness and planning required to try and get around the rules in an environment where basically every single ingredient is rationed or controlled.
Yeah, the combination, Fanta, sugar, and apples. It almost sounds comical on the surface, like some kind of macabre cooking show. But you mentioned how serious this is from an institutional security standpoint. Beyond just being alcohol, why is making hooch such a major infraction in a federal facility?
Oh, it hits several critical security and institutional control points all at once. First, obviously, it introduces an unregulated, often highly potent intoxicating substance. That's dangerous right there because it can lead to unpredictable behavior, violence, maybe self-harm. It can destabilize an entire unit. Second, producing hooch, it requires controlling ingredients, finding warm, dark places to hide the fermenting mixture, keeping it secret from staff and usually other inmates too. So that whole process inherently involves breaking multiple rules about sanitation, storage, movement, all of which represent a direct challenge to the authority and control of the facility staff.
So what's fascinating here is that this particular alleged infraction, it speaks to immediate behavior adjustments or maybe the lack of them in this highly restrictive environment. It suggests either like a really rapid adoption of institutional survival tactics or maybe just an immediate disregard for the seriousness of the confinement itself.
It's often the latter, I think, especially when someone is still adjusting to that profound loss of external freedoms. Making hooch isn't just a minor slip-up. It requires intentional, sustained effort. It really suggests a willingness to immediately flout core institutional rules, which is probably why the response, even if the eventual punishment was only a date delay, seems to have been so swift.
Okay, so when this was reportedly discovered, how did the internal officials initially discuss responding? What were the options on the table?
Well, there was an immediate internal discussion about potential punitive measures. The reports indicated that officials seriously considered moving Combs to a new unit. Now, in the FBP, transferring housing units is actually a significant administrative punishment. It totally disrupts any social connections you've made. It changes your work assignment. It just resets your whole environment. It sends a really powerful message about compliance.
But the final reported action was less severe in terms of that immediate disruption to his housing, wasn't it?
That's right. Sources indicate that officials ultimately decided to let him stay put in his current unit. This suggests maybe a more nuanced decision. Perhaps they recognized the offense, which likely led to the GTC revocation we talked about, but decided the disruption of a unit transfer wasn't necessary. Or maybe they factored in his high-profile nature, his recent arrival, choosing instead a disciplinary action focused purely on adding time.
Now, this is where the defense enters the picture, and they came out swinging with a strong counter-narrative. The denial issued just 2 days later, on Sunday, November 9th. It wasn't just some typical, soft legal statement. It was aggressive.
Oh, it was a full-throated rejection. The spokesperson described the circulating reports as false and reckless. They didn't equivocate at all. The specific denial about the alcohol was definitive. He has not violated any prison rules. Full stop. This puts the defense in direct factual opposition to whatever internal FBP investigation likely resulted in that date change.
And they strategically linked that denial directly to his supposed commitment to self-improvement and compliance while inside.
Precisely. They stress that Combs' sobriety and self-discipline are priorities, and he is taking them seriously. Now, this directly challenges the intent behind the alleged act, right? By confirming his commitment to sobriety and rehabilitation, they're framing the report as fundamentally contradictory to his current institutional goals, which, as we know, reportedly include participating in the drug treatment program. It's very effective narrative management.
They also issued an explicit public request, essentially telling the press and public to, well, calm down and expect more rumors like this.
Yes, exactly. The spokesperson explicitly appealed for patience, pointing out this was only his first week at Fort Dix and that, quote, rumors will surface throughout his time there. They requested the press and public give him the benefit of the doubt, the privacy to focus on his personal growth, and the grace to move forward in peace. It was a very clear attempt to condition the public and the media to treat future institutional reports with skepticism, setting a defensive standard right out of the gate.
It is an intensely aggressive posture for a legal team to take against, correctional facility disciplinary rumors. But before the dust could even settle on the alleged hooch, a second, entirely different kind of infraction reportedly surfaced. This moves us into Section 3. Allegation 2, the communication rule breach.
Yeah, this report emerged only 2 days after the hooch story on Monday, November 10th, apparently citing prison documents. This time, the alleged infraction wasn't about contraband or physical behavior, but about violating strict procedure regarding electronic communication, specifically phone calls.
Okay, so to understand the breach, we first need to understand the underlying rule structure for inmate calls. What is the fundamental FBP policy that was allegedly broken here?
Okay, the Federal Bureau of Prisons maintains a very strict policy. It does not allow inmates to add multiple people onto a call. No three-way calling, basically. This is a crucial security protocol. The system is designed to monitor conversations, verify the identity of the person on the external line, and crucially, prevent unauthorized communication that could relate to ongoing criminal activity, escape plans, maybe even witness tampering. Allowing a third party, whose identity and location can't be verified by the system, fundamentally compromises the integrity of that monitoring.
And the alleged breach was precisely that. Combs allegedly violated this rule by either initiating or participating in a three-way call from inside the prison. What was the potential consequence mentioned in the report for doing something like that?
The institutional documents cited in the reports apparently indicated he faced the risk of losing his phone privileges altogether. Now, that is a severe sanction. For any inmate, but especially one fighting a major appeal like he is, losing phone access is potentially devastating. It cuts off a primary lifeline to family, friends, and critically, his legal defense team.
So we have a clear rule, a reported violation, and a pretty severe potential punishment. But just like with the hooch allegation, the defense team immediately pushed back with a counter-narrative. And this time, they used a fundamental legal concept to justify the action: attorney-client privilege.
Yes, and this is the legal maneuver that makes this second allegation so complex. Spokesperson Judah Engelmayer strongly denied that Combs broke any policies. But the justification wasn't factual, like it didn't happen. It was procedural. The statement claimed, quote, the phone call he was on was initiated by an attorney, and it was attorney-client privilege and appropriate.
Okay, so this sets up a direct fundamental confrontation, doesn't it? Between institutional security protocol, no three-way calls, and essential legal rights attorney-client privilege. The FBP rule says no three-way calls for security reasons. The defense says privilege trumps that security rule in this case. What's the weight of that attorney-client privilege argument in this highly restricted environment?
Well, it raises that really important question. When security protocols clash directly with essential legal rights, which one gives way? Attorney-client privilege is, it's a near sacrosanct principle in the U.S. legal system. It guarantees that communications necessary for a defense remain confidential. The defense is essentially arguing that a general policy designed for broad security cannot be used to impede a client's fundamental right to adequate legal representation. And that representation might sometimes require a lawyer to include, say, a paralegal, an investigator, or maybe a specialist on the line during a necessary call.
So the argument isn't really that he wasn't on a call with more than two parties, but that the purpose of the call and the fact that an attorney initiated it made it legally exempt from the typical BOP security rule.
Precisely. It's a justification that hinges on legal necessity. Look, the FBP's focus is on preventing clandestine, unauthorized communication. The defense's focus is on establishing that this call wasn't arbitrary. It wasn't sneaking someone on. It was a necessary function of his defense, initiated by his counsel, and therefore it should be immunized from standard BOP disciplinary action. They're basically forcing the FBP to acknowledge that the need for privileged legal consultation has to supersede their administrative desire to just unilaterally ban all multi-party calls, no exceptions.
Has this specific conflict, attorney-client privilege versus the FBP's three-way call ban, has this been litigated often? Are there precedents where security has successfully denied privilege access in a similar way?
It's a constantly contested area, actually, especially as communication technology keeps evolving. Generally, courts uphold the FBP's right to monitor general inmate calls. That's pretty settled. But they are extremely cautious about limiting attorney-client access. Usually, the FBP has specialized, non-monitored lines specifically for privileged calls. However, if the FBP determined that the mechanism of the three-way call itself was used to somehow circumvent security, like, say, introducing an unauthorized non-privileged third party under the guise of legal counsel, they might argue the privilege was broken or abused. But the defense, by stressing that the attorney initiated it, is clearly trying to preempt that very accusation. They're suggesting all parties on that call were necessary members of the legal team. This specific dynamic means the FBP will likely face some intense internal legal pressure if they try to uphold a sanction like loss of phone privileges based on this.
This level of immediate, really aggressive internal legal maneuvering it's pretty breathtaking to watch unfold so quickly. Now, just to provide some balance here, we should note that despite these allegations flying around, Combs is also reportedly engaging in the structured activities required by the institution.
That's correct, and it's an important counterpoint. The sources did confirm that he is actively participating in two specific programs that demonstrate, conformity with rehabilitative goals. He is participating in the mandatory drug treatment program, which is significant given the hooch allegation, and he's also working an institutional job in the chapel library. These activities will definitely weigh in his favor during any internal disciplinary review process. They contrast sharply with the allegations of rule-breaking behavior.
Okay, so to summarize the immediate first few weeks of his confinement, we have the alleged manufacture of homemade alcohol, this vehemently denied three-way phone call, a really strong legal counter-defense invoking privilege, and the resulting confirmed pushback of his release date to June 4, 2028. And all of this is unfolding against an even larger, arguably higher stakes background, the aggressive legal challenge to the severity of the 50-month sentence itself.
Right, and that brings us neatly into Section 4, the legal battle and contested sentencing. It is absolutely vital to remind you, the listener, that his conviction, while serious, was limited in scope compared to the original charges. While he was convicted on those two counts, he was actually acquitted of some of the most damaging initial charges he faced.
Let's detail those specific acquittals, because they're really central to his legal team's strategy and their outrage about the sentence.
Right. Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking charges and, importantly, racketeering charges. Racketeering particularly often carries potentially decades-long sentences and speaks to the idea of a continuing criminal enterprise. The fact that the jury found him not guilty on those specific counts is the absolute foundation for the defense's primary claim of judicial overreach during the sentencing phase.
And this partial outcome, the split verdict, led to that massive sentencing disparity that triggered the legal team's very public outrage. Let's clearly highlight the vast difference between what the prosecution wanted, what the defense wanted, and what he actually got.
The requests were truly polar opposites. The defense argued for extreme mitigation, basically asking for no more than 14 months in prison, just over a year. Conversely, the prosecution, they were aiming for maximum deterrence and punishment, and they requested a severe 11 years. Judge Arun Subramanian ultimately landed on 50 months. That's just over 4 years.
And landing on 50 months, which is what, nearly 4 times what the defense requested, is what triggered that immediate and very public critique right after the sentencing on October 3rd. Attorney Mark Agnifilo, he did not hold back at all.
No, the criticism was instantaneous and highly targeted right at the judge. Agnifilo specifically and very aggressively called out Judge Subramanian. He claimed the judge acted as a 13th juror, one we did not choose. That is a profound legal accusation to make, especially right there in front of the press. He further accused the judge of essentially second-guessing the jury's verdict, implying that the judge improperly injected facts or considerations from the acquitted charges back into the sentencing decision to justify the 50 months.
Okay, that phrase, acting as a 13th juror, it strongly suggests the judge substituted his own judgment for the jury's findings. What was the specific legal concept Agnifilo pointed to regarding the length of the 50-month sentence? Why did they feel it was excessive based on the conviction itself?
Agnifilo accused the judge of using coercion as the primary justification for the length of the sentence. Now, to understand why this is such a strong potential appeal point, you have to look at the federal sentencing guidelines. A conviction on just 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution by itself might typically suggest a lower sentencing range under those guidelines. However, and this is key, federal judges are legally allowed to consider facts proven by a preponderance of the evidence during sentencing. That's a lower standard of proof than the jury's beyond a reasonable doubt standard used for conviction.
Okay. So even though the jury acquitted Combs of sex trafficking and racketeering, the judge might have still believed, based on the evidence presented during the trial, that elements related to those acquitted charges, like maybe coercion, were factually present, just not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And therefore, those elements were relevant when deciding how long the sentence for the convicted crimes should be.
That is precisely the legal leverage the judge possesses, and it's the absolute heart of the defense's grievance. The defense clearly believes the judge improperly leveraged that acquitted conduct, specifically allegations of coercion that were tied to the charges the jury rejected, to push the sentence up to 50 months, way beyond what they feel the convicted counts alone justified under their interpretation of the sentencing guidelines. They view this as clear judicial overreach. Essentially, they're arguing he's being punished, at least in terms of sentence length, for conduct the jury explicitly found him not guilty of.
And the resulting appeal strategy is built entirely upon this claim of judicial error, then.
The plan seems firm, yes. Combs' attorneys fully intend to appeal the sentence. They'll argue that the 50 months is substantively unreasonable, meaning it's just too long given the circumstances and the convictions. And they'll argue that Judge Subramanian improperly incorporated factors like this alleged coercion and other facts related to the acquitted charges that exceeded the bounds of appropriate judicial discretion at sentencing. They'll have to prove either that the judge's finding of those facts was clearly erroneous, or that the sentence imposed was ultimately an abuse of discretion.
Okay, so if we connect this highly technical, high-level legal battle happening in the appellate courts back down to the immediate kind of low-level institutional drama playing out inside Fort Dix, the whole environment becomes deeply conflicted, doesn't it? These alleged rule violations, the resulting date extension, they're all occurring against this backdrop of a vigorous legal challenge to the initial sentence length itself.
It creates a tremendous burden, I imagine, for the legal team. On one hand, they're arguing in a high court that the initial 50-month sentence is fundamentally unfair, it's legally flawed, it should be reduced or maybe even vacated. But on the other hand, the individual actually serving that sentence is immediately generating internal institutional disciplinary reports that are leading to the sentence being extended. Every documented infraction inside potentially undermines the narrative of unfairness and excessive punishment that they're trying so hard to build on the outside.
Let's delve a bit deeper into the FBP's likely motivation regarding these 2 allegations, starting with the hooch. The fact that the defense flat out denied it, calling the report false and reckless, suggests the defense believes they can maybe win that factual battle internally, or perhaps argue the evidence was flawed.
That flat denial is critical, strategically. Look, if the DHO process determined he was guilty of manufacturing or possessing hooch, that disciplinary finding becomes a permanent part of his institutional record. If the defense can successfully challenge that DHO finding, maybe by arguing misidentification or lack of proper procedure during the search or contamination of evidence, whatever they can potentially protect his record from that finding. The denial is the essential first step in that internal record-keeping fight. Had they admitted it and just tried to mitigate the punishment, that institutional record would be permanently stained with a finding of guilt for that specific infraction.
Right. And the fight over the three-way call is even more complex because, as you said, the defense is using a legal shield privilege rather than a simple factual denial it didn't happen. If the FBP pushes ahead with disciplinary action anyway, maybe revokes his phone privileges despite the privilege claim, what's the next legal step for the defense?
If his phone privileges are indeed revoked based on that three-way call, you can bet the defense will immediately file an administrative grievance within the FBP system. If that fails, the next step would likely be filing a potential writ of habeas corpus in federal court. They would argue that the denial of privileged communication is a direct violation of his Sixth Amendment right to effective counsel. They'd argue irreparable harm to his defense, especially considering the major appeal that's pending. This move instantly transforms what seems like a simple institutional rule breach into a full-scale constitutional challenge, bringing the federal courts into the prison's disciplinary process.
So the BOP's decision on whether to fully sanction him for that phone call, despite the privilege claim, it's actually a pretty high-risk move for the institution itself.
It really is. The BOP has to weigh the necessity of upholding their security rule against the enormous legal firepower and the fundamental constitutional backing of attorney-client privilege. It just demonstrates how these high-profile cases can really push the boundaries of institutional policy and ultimately force judges to clarify that complex, delicate balance between necessary security measures and fundamental constitutional rights within a carceral setting.
Let's circle back quickly to the core consequence we started with. That release date changed to June 4, 2028. We established that the most likely mechanism is the revocation of good time credits. The sheer speed of this revocation happening within just days of the public reports suggests a highly expedited DHO process. Why the rush? Why so fast?
Well, the FBP has every incentive to act swiftly in high-profile cases like this. They need to demonstrate control and adherence to institutional order, both to the public watching from the outside and, perhaps more importantly, to the rest of the inmate population inside. An immediate, visible sanction, like adding 27 days to the sentence right away, sends a very clear message. Institutional rules apply to everyone, regardless of their celebrity status or wealth. This rapid processing ensures that the FBP is seen as authoritative and decisive in managing its population. It prevents any perception of special treatment.
It also means the defense has to fight this internal battle almost on a moment-by-moment basis, which must be exhausting. They're not just managing his external legal strategy for the appeal, they're also effectively acting as internal institutional compliance monitors for him.
That dual responsibility is precisely why the level of legal defense here seems so intense and immediate. They are simultaneously trying to manage two separate legal realities: the High Court's review of the original sentence and the sort of administrative court's review of his day-to-day conduct inside. Winning the appeal only really matters if he maintains his good time credit record while he's inside. Losing that GTC record, even over technicalities like these alleged violations, definitely hurts their appellate argument that the initial sentence was already excessive and unfair.
Let's analyze that potential impact on the appeal just a bit further. Appellate courts, they generally focus on technical legal errors made by the trial judge, right? Not necessarily on subsequent inmate conduct. But how does this current conflict, these internal reports, actually impact the narrative of the appeal?
That's a great point. Technically, the appellate court is focused solely on whether Judge Supermanian erred legally, for instance, by improperly using coercion or facts from the acquitted charges to justify the 50 months. However, an appellate argument often involves more than just dry legal points. It frequently includes a narrative about the client's character, maybe their remorse, their commitment to rehabilitation. The defense is arguing, look, 50 months is far too much. He deserves less time. He's learned his lesson. But the FDP record simultaneously shows him allegedly violating rules involving substance abuse and communication protocols within the first few weeks. It severely weakens the perceived credibility and sincerity of the defense's broader plea for leniency and justice.
So in effect, the FPP disciplinary reports, whether ultimately fully upheld or not, provide immediate, potentially inconvenient, and seemingly objective evidence that could contradict the defense's narrative. The narrative that an already overly harsh sentence is being served by a compliant individual who's committed to personal growth.
Exactly. While the appellate court might not technically cite the Hooch report in its legal ruling, it shifts the entire dynamic of the case presentation. It allows a prosecution, when responding to the appeal, to subtly paint a picture of an inmate who is immediately challenging authority, failing to adhere to basic structure, suggesting that maybe the initial 50-month sentence, far from being overly harsh, might have been warranted given the character seemingly exhibited immediately upon confinement.
Okay, let's try and synthesize everything for you, the listener, bringing all these complex pieces together. We started with a firm release date, May 8, 2028. That date is now officially June 4th, 2028. That change is confirmed by the FBP as of November 12th.
The official, documented cause for that 27-day delay remains undisclosed by the Bureau of Prisons. However, the timing is undeniable. The change occurred just days after the emergence of two major, highly publicized allegations of rule violations at Fort Dix. This strongly suggests that a disciplinary hearing officer ruling and a revocation of good time credits are the most likely, almost certain cause.
The central tension here is this really dynamic conflict playing out across, effectively, two courts simultaneously. On one side, you have these serious institutional allegations, the reported possession of homemade alcohol, the alleged procedural breach of the three-way call rule, and on the other side, you have this unified, immediate, and very aggressive legal defense that used the strongest possible tools available, calling the Hooch reports false and reckless, and invoking the heavy constitutional weight of attorney-client privilege to defend the communication breach.
The relevance to you listening is this. Incarceration doesn't stop the legal battle. It simply shifts the battleground and adds new layers. This deep dive really shows how quickly the internal rules and disciplinary processes of the FBP can directly impact the external legal status and timeline of an individual, even one who is already actively challenging his conviction and sentence. The 50-month fight is now coupled with this continuous internal fight against the institutional clock and that disciplinary rulebook.
And it sets up that final provocative thought, which really hangs over the entire case now. The legal team, as we know, intends to appeal the 50-month sentence, citing judicial coercion and overreach, claiming the judge acted improperly like a 13th juror. So given this aggressive appellate strategy, how might the official documentation of these alleged rule violations, even if the FBP is only partially successful in upholding them internally, how might that impact the ultimate perception or maybe even the subtle success of that planned appellate argument when it finally comes before the higher court?
That question really highlights the continuous, often unforgiving nature of the entire legal process, both inside and outside the prison walls. The defense now has to manage a client fighting for freedom based on complex judicial error grounds, while simultaneously managing reports of basic institutional indiscretion. The battle for his freedom is now undeniably a dual fight: an external challenge against the fundamental length of the sentence, and an internal day-by-day battle against the clock and the institutional rulebook that governs every single moment he serves. And every day he serves, his lawyers are not just working on the appeal, they're also fighting to protect his institutional record from exactly these kind of incidents.
It is a profound demonstration of the stakes involved, isn't it? Where suddenly a glass of allegedly fermented Fanta and apples can potentially become relevant evidence, or at least background noise, in a high-stakes federal appellate case.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating intersection of celebrity, law, and the realities of institutional control. And we will certainly continue to watch how that complex legal balance plays out.